In the year 754, the echoing halls of the Hieria Palace witnessed a decree that threatened to strip the Christian world of its visual soul. Emperor Constantine V, backed by an army of iconoclastic bishops, declared that every painted image of Christ and the saints was an idol, a dead and soul-destroying vanity that polluted the sanctity of the Church. Across the empire, ancient mosaics were plastered over, priceless icons were cast into bonfires, and the faithful who dared to hide small wooden panels of the Virgin Mary were branded as heretics or faced the executioner's blade. This was not merely a dispute over art, it was a violent theological civil war that posed a staggering question. If God had truly become a man of flesh and bone, was it a sin to look upon his face? The answer would not come from the battlefields or the imperial decrees of soldier emperors, but from the courageous maneuvering of an empress regent and a meticulously convened assembly in the historic city of Nicaea. The Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787 stands as the watershed moment where the Church reclaimed its aesthetic heritage, not by simple preference, but by grounding the use of images in the very bedrock of the Incarnation. It was here that the silent preaching of the icon was finally vindicated, ensuring that the Christian faith would remain a religion not just of the heard word, but of the seen glory. The history of the Christian Church is punctuated by moments of intense theological crisis, but few were as visually and socially disruptive as the iconoclast controversy. At the heart of this struggle lay a fundamental question: can the infinite be captured in wood and pigment, or does the veneration of images constitute a lapse into pagan idolatry? The Seventh Ecumenical Council, convened in 787 at Nicaea, stands as the definitive ecclesiastical response to this dilemma. Known as the Second Council of Nicaea, this assembly did not merely settle a dispute over art, it reasserted the theological implications of the Incarnation, arguing that if God truly became man, he entered the realm of the visible and therefore the representable. The significance of this council extends far beyond the 8th century. For the Eastern Orthodox tradition, it represents the final pillar of the faith, completing the cycle of the 7 great councils that define the boundaries of the Catholic and Ecumenical Church. While its reception varies across the modern denominational landscape, with Roman Catholicism embracing it and many Protestant traditions remaining skeptical, its impact on the liturgy, piety, and aesthetic life of global Christianity is incalculable. Today we explore the intricate political maneuvering, the rigorous patristic scholarship, and the enduring dogmatic definitions that emerged from this momentous gathering. The road to Nicaea was paved with political volatility and the persistent threat of military insurrection. The restoration of icon veneration was not a simple administrative decree, but a delicate operation requiring the stabilization of a fractured empire. The catalyst for this restoration was the Empress Regent Irene, acting on behalf of her young son, Constantine VI. Recognizing that the previous decades of iconoclasm had alienated the Byzantine state from both the Roman papacy and the ancient patriarchates of the East, Irene sought a return to traditional, orthodox authority. The initial attempt to resolve the crisis occurred in August 786 at the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. However, the imperial capital remained a stronghold of iconoclast sentiment, particularly within the military ranks. These iconoclastic soldiery, loyal to the memory of the fiercely anti-icon emperors of the past, burst into the church and violently dispersed the assembly. This failure forced the papal legates to flee the city, nearly ending the prospects for a council before it had truly begun. Irene's response to this mutiny serves as a masterclass in Byzantine political strategy. Rather than surrender to the mob, she recalled the papal legates as they reached Sicily and set about purging the capital of its disloyal elements. She systematically replaced the mutinous troops with officers in whom she possessed absolute confidence, effectively disarming the local opposition. To ensure the safety of the bishops and prevent further military interference, the location of the synod was moved from the volatile capital to Nicaea in Bithynia, a site chosen for its symbolic resonance as the location of the First Ecumenical Council. When the council finally opened on September 24, 787, in the Church of St. Sophia in Nicaea, The composition of the assembly reflected the complex geopolitical reality of the 8th century. Approximately 350 bishops attended, but the presence of the broader Christian world was hampered by Islamic expansion. The patriarchates of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, all residing under Muslim domination, could not send their respective leaders. Instead, two monks, John and Thomas, arrived to represent the apostolic seats of the Orient. While these monks lacked direct mandates from the patriarchs themselves, who were often unaware the council had even been convoked, the council accepted their presence under the principle of sedibus impeditus, impeded seats. Their participation was justified by the necessity of the moment, ensuring that the council could claim a truly ecumenical character, despite the physical barriers of the caliphate. Crucial to the council's legitimacy was the endorsement of Pope Hadrian I. The Roman legates were given the highest honor, signing documents first and heading all membership lists. Hadrian's correspondence with Irene and Patriarch Tarasius confirms that the Holy See not only approved of the convocation, but viewed the proceedings as being held in accordance with Roman direction. Within the sessions, the leadership was tripartite. While the Empress Regent and her son were represented by high-ranking officials like the former consul Petronius and the imperial chamberlain John, they did not direct the theological discourse in person. The actual conduct of the sessions fell to Patriarch Tarasius, a former imperial secretary whose moderate stance and diplomatic skill allowed him to navigate the diverse interests of the Roman legates, the monastic representatives, and the formerly iconoclast bishops seeking reconciliation. The central theological achievement of the Seventh Ecumenical Council was the articulation of a nuanced vocabulary to describe the relationship between the believer, the material icon, and the divine prototype. This was not merely an aesthetic debate, but a defense of the incarnation. The council asserted that since the Son of God took on human flesh, he became visible and circumscribed, thereby sanctifying the material world and making pictorial representation not only possible, but necessary to affirm his true humanity. To navigate the charge of idolatry, the council established a rigorous linguistic distinction. Latreia, or adoration, is the absolute sacrificial worship due to God alone. Offering this to an image would indeed be the sin of idolatry. Proskynesis, or veneration, refers to a secondary level of honor shown to icons as they represent Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the saints. The council clarified that the honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype. Just as one might kiss a photograph of a loved one without confusing the paper for the person, the Orthodox believer venerates the wood and paint as a window into the spiritual reality it depicts. The Council's defense of icons was deeply integrated into the wider framework of Christology. Drawing heavily upon the writings of St. John of Damascus, the Assembly argued that refusing to depict Christ was a subtle form of Gnosticism or Docetism, the belief that Christ only appeared to have a body. By endorsing the use of crucifixes and icons, the Council maintained that these representations do not diminish Christ's divinity, but rather celebrate the divinization of his flesh. This emphasis highlighted a distinct Eastern priority. While the West often leaned toward distinguishing the natures of Christ, the East utilized icons to emphasize their inseparable unity. The actual proceedings of the Council were characterized by a meticulous examination of the Church's historical record. The goal was to demonstrate that icon veneration was not an innovation, but a restoration of ancient practice. During the sixth session, a line-by-line refutation of the Horos, produced by the Iconoclast Council of Hieria in 754 occurred. The Seventh Council formally declared that earlier gathering to be non-ecumenical. The justification for this dismissal was based on the absence of the 5 major patriarchates. Neither the Pope nor the Eastern Patriarchs had been represented at Hieria. The bishops did not rely solely on abstract logic. They engaged in extensive exegetical and patristic work. They noted that even the tabernacle and the Temple of Solomon contained images, demonstrating that God had sanctioned religious art for specific purposes. The Council compiled a vast collection of quotes from the Church Fathers to prove that the veneration of images was a tradition passed down through the centuries. In a poignant moment, during the fifth session, an icon was physically brought into the hall, serving as a silent participant in the debates. A significant portion of the council's energy was spent on the treatment of former iconoclasts. The council, led by the moderate patriarch Tarasius, opted for a path of mercy. Bishops who publicly renounced their errors and embraced the new definition were allowed to retain their seats. This approach was intended to heal the schism within the Byzantine clergy and the monastic hierarchy. While the dogmatic definition of icons remains the most famous output of the council, the assembly also addressed the internal health of the church through the promulgation of 22 disciplinary canons. These decrees were designed to fortify ecclesiastical structures and eliminate the corrupting influence of secular power that had often fueled the iconoclast movement. A primary concern for the council was the manner in which leadership was selected. The third canon specifically prohibits the civil government from appointing bishops. By declaring elections by secular authorities to be null and void, the council sought to decouple the spiritual office from imperial politics. This reform was an essential step in ensuring that the church's leadership was beholden to apostolic tradition rather than the whims of the reigning monarch. The council also moved aggressively against simony, the buying or selling of ecclesiastical offices. The logic behind this condemnation was rooted in the preservation of the sanctity of the priesthood. If an office could be purchased, it became a commodity of the state rather than a calling from God. Furthermore, the council introduced various regulations regarding monastic and clerical conduct to restore the moral authority of the church after decades of internal division. These canons aimed to create a disciplined, self-governing body capable of upholding the Orthodox faith against future imperial interference. The final stages of the council were marked by the formalization of its decisions through the condemnation of its predecessors and the establishment of a new legal and liturgical reality. Central to this process was the explicit rejection of the Council of Hieria in 754. The Seventh Council declared the previous assembly to be not ecumenical because it lacked representation from the Pope and the other four major patriarchs. The bishops at Nicaea proceeded to refute the arguments of the 754 Council one by one, methodically dismantling the theological architecture of iconoclasm. In a move that linked the Council's victory to the legacy of those who had suffered for the faith, the Synod issued formal anathemas against the chief iconoclasts. Conversely, it glorified the leading defenders of icons, St. Germanos, St. John of Damascus, and George of Cyprus, declaring that the Trinity has made these three glorious. This was not merely a retrospective honor, but a dogmatic seal on the theology of John of Damascus. Following the close of the sessions, copies of the Council's acts were sent to Pope Hadrian I, who approved them and ordered their translation into Latin. This papal endorsement was vital for the Council's status as the Seventh Ecumenical Council. Within the empire, the immediate result was the restoration of images in churches, effectively ending the first period of iconoclasm. However, the restoration was not universal or immediate. A significant iconoclast party remained, particularly within the Byzantine army. It would take nearly another half-century and a second wave of iconoclasm before the Council's decisions were permanently reaffirmed in 843 by Empress Theodora and Patriarch Methodius. This final triumph is still celebrated today on the first Sunday of Lent as the victory of orthodoxy, cementing the Seventh Council as the final word on the seven pillars of the faith. The legacy of Nicaea Seketh remains a point of divergence in the modern religious landscape. Eastern Orthodoxy embraces the Council as the completion of its dogmatic foundation. Roman Catholicism recognizes it as the seventh of its 21 ecumenical councils. Protestantism generally offers little to no formal recognition, particularly among evangelicals, due to the Council's official dogma regarding the veneration of icons and saints. The intellectual heart of the Seventh Ecumenical Council was not found in a simple declaration of faith, but in a systematic line-by-line deconstruction of the definition produced by the Iconoclast Council of Hieria in 754. The iconoclasts had argued that since the divine nature of Christ is infinite and uncircumscribable, any attempt to paint him was a theological impossibility. They claimed that an artist could only depict Christ's humanity, thereby separating it from his divinity, or attempting to blend the two into a confused mess. The Council of Nicaea II countered this by focusing on the reality of the Incarnation. The bishops argued that if Christ could not be depicted, then he was not truly man. By taking on a physical body, the Word of God accepted the limitations of space and visibility. Therefore, to deny the icon was to deny the reality of God's entry into human history. The Council asserted that the icon does not attempt to depict the essence of God, which remains invisible, but the hypostasis of the Word made flesh. Beyond the high Christology, the Council addressed the practical how of icon usage. They argued that icons serve as books for the illiterate, providing a visual narrative of salvation history. However, they moved beyond mere education, suggesting that the image acts as a medium for anamnesis. By seeing the image, the mind is lifted up to the original subject. To insulate the Church against the persistent charge of idolatry, the Council introduced a sophisticated linguistic framework. This was the mechanism by which the Church could justify bowing before an image while maintaining strict monotheism. The Council established a definitive boundary between two types of devotion. Latreia, adoration. This is the sacrificial worship and absolute devotion reserved exclusively for the Holy Trinity. It is the worship in spirit and truth that can never be directed toward a created object. Proskynesis, veneration. This is an honor of respect, similar to the way a subject might bow before a king or a person might kiss the gospel book. The Council decreed that icons of Christ, the Theotokos, Mother of God, the angels, and the saints should receive honorary adoration, timtique proskynesis, but never latreia. This distinction was vital because it transformed the act of bowing from a potentially pagan ritual into a targeted expression of Christian honor that passes over to the prototype. The Council was not merely a debating society. It was a legislative body tasked with repairing a fractured institution. The decades of iconoclasm had seen a massive transfer of power from the Church to the state, and Nicaea II sought to reclaim that lost ground. One of the most significant outcomes was the Third Canon, which struck at the heart of imperial interference. It decreed that any appointment of a bishop, priest, or deacon made by secular rulers was null and void. This was a direct response to the iconoclast emperors, who had filled the ranks of the clergy with political loyalists. By mandating that bishops be chosen by other bishops, the Council sought to ensure that the how of church leadership was governed by apostolic succession rather than imperial whim. A major crisis faced by the Council was what to do with the hundreds of bishops who had previously signed the iconoclast decrees. The hardliners, mostly from the monastic ranks, demanded that these bishops be deposed. However, Patriarch Tarasius, with the support of the Roman legates, applied the principle of oikonomia, a pastoral flexibility for the sake of the Church's unity. They allowed the lapsed bishops to be restored to their sees upon a public confession of the Orthodox faith. This move was essential for stabilizing the empire and preventing a permanent schism within the Byzantine clergy. The Council concluded on October 23, 787, with a final session held at the Magnaura Palace in Constantinople in the presence of Irene and Constantine VI. The decrees were signed, and the triumph of orthodoxy seemed complete. While the Council was immediately accepted in the East and by the Pope in Rome, its reception in the West was initially complicated. Charlemagne's court, receiving a poor Latin translation that confused veneration with worship, initially rejected the Council in the Libri Carolini. It took centuries for the West to fully align with the nuances of Nicene theology. In the East, a brief second wave of iconoclasm emerged in the 9th century, but the theological work of 787 proved insurmountable. In 843, the decisions of the Seventh Ecumenical Council were permanently ratified. To this day, the Sunday of Orthodoxy celebrates this council not just as a victory for art, but as the final, definitive defense of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. The restoration of the holy icons was never merely a victory for the arts. It was a profound reaffirmation of the tangible reality of the divine. By defending the image, the Seventh Ecumenical Council ensured that the Christian faith would remain anchored in the physical world, reminding us that through the incarnation, matter itself has been sanctified. As you consider the legacy of Nicaea II, reflect on the icons in your own life. In an age dominated by fleeting digital imagery, how do we discern the difference between a distraction that pulls us away from truth and a window that leads us toward it? The Council teaches us that the material world is not a barrier to the spiritual, but a bridge. How might you more intentionally recognize the presence of the infinite within the finite beauty of the world around you? The history of the Church is a vast tapestry of struggle, genius, and transformation. If you found this deep dive into the Seventh Ecumenical Council enlightening, don't let the journey end here. Subscribe to Theology Today, where we explore historical narratives and theological insights delivered every week. Join a community of thinkers and believers dedicated to exploring the rich heritage of our faith. Click the button below to stay connected and ensure you never miss an episode of this ongoing story.